The story begins with some event taking place, attended by stately men and girls in luxurious dresses. Two girls are standing and heatedly discussing another shy girl, saying, "Just look at her, she's standing there alone. And why did she come? Here she is, standing in a fluffy blue and white dress." It was precisely this that those two ladies discussed with such interest. But the discussions don't end there. They continue to talk about the fact that this girl came to meet the great magician. Someone's footsteps are heard, but during the conversations no one paid attention to it. The girls continued to say that someone would not pay attention to her. Suddenly someone shouted, "Estefania!" It was that same great magician. He was rapidly approaching that shy girl. Everyone suddenly fell silent in surprise and could not understand who he was addressing. The magician looked intently at the girl in the blue and white dress. "This is Estefania." The girl, meanwhile, stood and looked at him with a frightened look. As soon as he approached her, pulled his hand to her face and took her cheek, the confused Estefania could only say, "Huh?" He looked at her smiling, then said, "Stupid." Taking her by the waist, they left. This story is about the beloved of the strongest magician, but, unfortunately, her fate is sealed. A girl in a yellow skirt walked along the spacious and bright corridor and carried a cup in her hands. She coughed sharply and violently until her chest hurt. But the pain quickly disappeared when she heard the cry of, "Estefania, what are you doing there? Come here quickly." She immediately came into the room with this cup, walked into it, and saw how Mom reassured her sister and told Angelica not to cry, that everything would be fine. Angelica lay motionless and tears flowed from her eyes. All she could say was, "But." "Angelica!" Estefania shouted and ran to the bed where the girl was lying. She brought hot milk with honey and slipped the cup to Angelica. Angelica aggressively knocked the cup out of Estefania's hands and said that she did not want to drink it. Estefania stood confused and looked at the cup, which had shattered into pieces. Milk spread between the shards. Mom displeasedly said that Estefania should not irritate Angelica because she was not feeling well. She was very upset and apologized. Meanwhile, my mother began to say displeasedly to get out and leave. Meanwhile, Mom asked Angelica what had happened. Angelica began to cry even more and said that her stomach hurt. Then Mom hugged Angelica and started crying, saying that because of her, Angelica was born like this. Estefania, looking at this, continued to clean up that broken cup. Estefania looked at all this and she simply had no words. Why they were treating her so unfairly. Unable to bear this injustice, she ran out of the room. If she tells her mom that she remembered her past life, her mom will probably think she's crazy. Nobody will believe these fairy tales. The fact is that she was reborn into one of the characters in the novel, The Great Magician's Beloved. The story tells of a girl with an unfortunate fate who meets a magician who, with the help of his power, helps restore the homeland and the former greatness of the main character. And her name is Angelica Lana Bylist, that is, her younger sister. It's ironic to be reborn as the main character's older sister. She is definitely in the world of that novel and remembers its plot very clearly. They are descendants of the royal family of the eastern country of Isabella. But unfortunately, they had to flee their homeland and settle in this villa. This is where Angelica lives, who has had poor health since early childhood, and an overprotective mother who blows away the dust from her. Well, Estefania, since they are ordinary refugees from another country, they have no servants, no power, no money. She may have been living in this world for a long time, but she still can't remember what the role of Estefania was in the plot of the novel. Probably an ordinary minor character whose fate was not revealed in the book. The eldest daughter, unloved and forgotten by everyone, runs errands. Every day she regrets that God gave her a second life. After all, here she is like in hell on earth. The girl screams and asks Ash to take the order. She smiled with a plate in her hands and said that she was already running. She brought a pork chop with vegetables and apologized for the wait. The guest thanked him with a smile and asked to bring him another glass of intoxicating drink. The waiter shouted and asked for another beer for the guest. He was told that they were already pouring it. Their family has no money at all, so she has to work in the evenings. In order to hide her identity, she pretends to be Ash, a young man who works as a waiter in a bar. It's a pretty popular place, so they pay well. She has to work every day, so she gets very tired. But at least here she can escape from reality. That is, no one needs her eldest daughter. The waiter approached the guest with a smile and said that everything was ready. The guest, meanwhile, turned to Ash. He says that Ash looks very poor, asks if everything is fine with him, and he apologized for saying it all so directly. Ash was surprised and said in a calm tone that everything was fine with him. The guest didn't think so and asked very excitedly, "What's good here?" He pointed his finger at him and said that his face was pale and tired, and the hands nothing but skin and bones. Immediately the guest jumped in, approached a young man who was sitting calmly eating, grabbed his hand and proudly said that this was a doctor and he should examine this guy. Two more people supported the guest. One said that he completely agreed that the guy doesn't look very good. The second sees Ash every day on his shift. It's time to rest. Everyone attacked Ash with words that such a schedule could lead him to the grave, but the guy refused and said that everything was really fine with him. And then suddenly he coughed sharply and very strongly. Everyone shouted, "Ash!" But the guy, without foreshadowing trouble, simply smiled, apologized, and said that he might have caught a cold somewhere. When suddenly he glanced at his hand and his speech was taken away from surprise, he was thrown into the cold by what he saw. There was a blood stain on his hand. Everyone in the room also froze at what they saw. Out of fear, everyone began to call the doctor and ask him to examine the young man as quickly as possible. Well, as usual, Ash began to deny everything. Then a woman came up to him, put her hand on his shoulder, and began to insist that Ash should not be stubborn, because it would be completely free. People unanimously said to grab him. The doctor took Ash in his arms and carried him into the room to tell him something, and the guests were all shocked that the doctor picked up the young man in his arms. When they were alone, Ash apologized with a smile and said that he knew that he needed more rest and that he really didn't have any pain. The guys were just exaggerating. The doctor, with a very upset and serious look, said that he didn't think so. He was surprised that Ash was still standing. Ash felt uneasy from such words. He stood with a blank look and could not realize that everything was so bad. All his symptoms pointed to Jugga disease, the doctor said. This is a very rare and incurable disease. While Ash listened to all this, his gaze became more and more empty. He sat down and thought about the words and realized that he knew a lot about this disease. The worst thing about this disease is that your whole body gradually stops functioning. The doctor, with a trembling voice, said that unfortunately no one has yet invented a cure for this disease. Unfortunately, Estefania will face a terrible and painful death. She thought about it and realized why she didn't remember anything about Estefania's fate, because in the novel itself it was only mentioned about her. Ash asks the doctor how long he has left to live. The doctor sits with folded hands and is silent, because he understands how sad this all is. After a long silence, the doctor finally said that based on the symptoms, there is not much time at all. Ash asked excitedly how much longer he had left. The doctor lowered his head again, lit his eyes, and was silent for a long time, choosing the right words. Then he said that Ash would be lucky if he lived for another 3 months, because his condition indicated the last stage of the disease, so death could come sooner. As he said, there is no cure for such a disease, so the doctor cannot help. The doctor lowered his head and apologized for being powerless in this case. But Ash jumped up, took the doctor by the shoulders, and insisted that he raise his head, that there was no need to worry. Everything would be fine with him. The doctor could not stand it and shouted what order could there be, and fell silent. He looked at Ash's face, beaming with a smile, and was so shocked looking at him that he couldn't even say anything. With a wide and beaming smile, Ash told the doctor in a calm voice that everything would be fine, honestly. She was barely allowed to leave work. Finally, she can be alone with herself. She walked and thought about how they received the news that she would soon die. Everyone got drunk out of grief. This is all nice, of course, but she would never have thought that they would worry about her so much. What an irony. They know absolutely nothing about her, but they worry much more than their own family. She was walking along a dark street and heard a rustling in the bushes. Some 2 major boys and girls come out from there and begin to make strange sounds and defend themselves. Then the boy turns around and rudely and aggressively begins to say why she's hanging around here. Estefania stands at a loss and doesn't know what to answer to this. The boy again continues to offend her and suggests that Estefania must be a servant. The girl, covering her nose with a handkerchief, says displeasedly, "What a wretched appearance she is, and she smells of fumes. It's some kind of nightmare." Suddenly these two began whispering to each other, wondering how such a mob could live in such a luxurious mansion. Estefania thought that since her family settled in this villa, she began to notice something strange. For example, a vase was standing on the table and suddenly disappeared. Then she noticed that the old cuckoo clock on the wall was missing. All things began to disappear without a trace. It's like someone stole them. Having come to her senses, Estefania asked with a grin what were these gentlemen doing so late at night at the gates of her house. Yunash rudely replied that it was none of her business. Continuing to smile, she slowly walked home. Immediately the boy screamed so that she would not move and slammed his foot on the asvad. The girl said that if Estefania suddenly wants to tell someone she saw them here, Estefania turned around without listening and ran home, and she shouted after her that she would personally take care of it from her and her entire family. She finally left them and said with relief that she was home. Looking up, she saw her sister Angelica on the stairs. She had a dissatisfied look. With the same dissatisfaction, she said that Estefania was late. Estefania asked Angelica why she was not sleeping yet. Angelica began to complain that she was suffering from illness, lying in this outback, as if in a cage. And Estefania also dared to go to bars and have fun in abundance. Estefania felt offended and said that Angelica had misunderstood everything, and she was not having fun at all. Angelica leaned on the railing of the stairs and plaintively asked whether Estefania was not burdened by this miserable existence, being born with these damned eyes. The reason they fled their homeland is that they and their sister were born with cursed eyes, and all the people from the royal family have blue eyes. No one was happy about their birth. Angelica said that she was very jealous of her sister, even if she was not born with blue eyes, but she was a healthy and strong girl who could safely go out whenever she wanted. And Angelica is like a bird locked in a cage, weak and forever suffering from this pain. Why was Estefania lucky enough to be born so healthy, while the other one had to rot at home? Estefania froze at these words. Knowing that her health was not as good as Angelica described, she said that her sister was wrong. The main character of the novel is Angelica, an exiled princess of an eastern country who lost her older sister to an incurable disease. In the novel, after Estefania's death, Angelica changed a lot. Estefania's death greatly affected her worldview. Right now, we are approaching the very beginning of the novel, where the older sister dies. The mother of two girls appears and asks why Angelica is not asleep yet. Worried about her sick daughter, she says that it's time to go to bed since it gets cold in the house at night. Estefania tried to talk to them, but Angelica and her mother turned around and began to leave. Estefania continued to shout in the back, Mom. Mom turned around and asked what Estefania wanted from her. Estefania said that an important topic needs to be discussed. Not particularly pleased, the mother answered her rudely, saying that this important conversation could not wait until tomorrow because she was very tired. But the girl continues to say that she needs to tell her something important and it can't wait until the morning. Mom didn't want to listen to her and started to leave. Unheard, Estefania stood confused and listened as her mother said that she was behaving selfishly and not letting her sleep. 3 months remain, and Estefania still doesn't believe that she will die again soon. However, this is inevitable. She is destined to pacify a second time. She would like to finally meet Mr. Overcoat. She lay there and thought about it all the time. Great magician Overcoat Crowley, her favorite hero of this novel, as well as Angelica's future husband. She wants to see him live, to look at him at least with one eye, not just read the description of his appearance, and to see it, smell it, watch its facial expressions. Just by looking at him, she can rest forever. Suddenly, as if electrocuted, she caught up and looked out the window. It was a dark and deep night in the window. The moon was full and shining brightly. There was not a single cloud in the sky, so all the stars could be seen very well. After thinking for a second, she realized that there was nothing stopping her from meeting him now. She literally lives in the world of this novel. Doubting, she finally decided, since she was destined to die. Hitting herself in the face, she realized that she must fulfill her cherished desire. Sitting and looking out the window, she swore that she would definitely meet Mr. Chanel. Estefania put on a blue dress, took an umbrella because it was raining outside, and went to meet her dream. Walking down the street, she looked up and saw a familiar person. It was a doctor. He recognized her and said in surprise if it was Ash. She looked at him with a smile with her large, beautiful yellow eyes. They stood opposite each other, and Estefania began to thank him and said that she wanted to finally thank him for everything. With a smile, the doctor asked where she was going at night in such a downpour. She replied that she was going to the Central Lands. Surprised, the doctor asked, "Are they really going to valuable lands? There must be doctors living there who are developing a cure for Jugga disease." He said that in her condition it was extremely dangerous to go there. With a grin, she answered him that there was no reason to worry about her. She added that this was her last mystical wish before her imminent death. The doctor replied that since she wanted it so much, no one had the right to stop her. She agreed with him and thanked the doctor for revealing to her the truth about the disease. In response, she heard that this was his medical duty and he could not do otherwise. She once again expressed her sincere gratitude to him. The doctor replied that the guys from the bar would probably want to say goodbye to her and asked if she would come to them. She would really like to come in and say goodbye, but she's in a hurry and it's time for her to go. That's it, the doctor said and looked after Estefania. He stood for a long time and looked after her while she was leaving, and suddenly Ash shouted. He didn't know if they would meet again, and asked him to take care of his life and fight for it until his very last breath. Lost in thought, she turned around and said that her name was Estefania Lana Bielest, and asked her to remember it. The doctor stood motionless. He was shocked by what he heard. That's right. She's a member of the royal family, the doctor said, which from birth was defenseless and useless to anyone. The irony of her life is that her current life is no different from her past. Sick younger sister, overprotective mother, and Estefania, the older sister, who is obliged to work every day in order to provide her sister with expensive treatment. Looking into the reflection of the glass, she sees the very real herself, just some kind of déjà vu. Well, her life ended due to constant overwork. Smiling at the lyceums, looking out the window, she sat and thought that now she was dying of an incurable disease. What kind of bad luck? That life, they were all like hell. But there is him in this world, she thought about Overcoat Crowley. Last time she died without knowing the joy of life and tried exclusively for the sake of others. But this time, Estefania wants to spend the rest of her life fulfilling her own desires. And then the driver said that they had arrived at their destination. Estefania came out and froze. A completely different world opened up before her. Then with a bewitching look she said, "This is what it is. The homeland of magicians, the Central Land. This is where Mr. Chanel lives. She comes from the Eastern Kingdom, Isabel. But besides the four kingdoms, a great land of Mogu and sorcerers was born, and its name was Central Lands. Since this is the homeland of all magicians, by nature the locals are very proud, arrogant, and do not like strangers. So you shouldn't attract unnecessary attention to yourself. You need to act according to your original plan," Estefania thought. She thought that the author of the novel was exaggerating, that all the inhabitants of magical lands were arrogant, until she saw this. Two young guys couldn't share something. They had multicolored fireballs in their hands, and they shouted loudly throughout the entire area. One said that he had an appointment for today. The second shouted that there was a line. Estefania stood there confused and peed that she had to run, otherwise they would hit her too. Without having time to do anything, a very strong roar was heard around her, glass fragments scattered in all directions. Estefania quickly bent down, closed her eyes, covered her head with her hands, hoping that she would be carried away. Out of nowhere, she heard a voice asking if everything was okay with my lady. She opened her eyes, stood up and looked around and saw no one around. Suddenly this voice spoke again and said, "I am lower, my lady." Estefania lowered her head and saw a sweet, handsome, black-haired boy with big green eyes. From his beauty, Estefania froze and could only say baby. The kid asked Estefania, "My lady, you must be the norm?" She said that it was dangerous here and she needed to go to a safer place. The norm is people who do not know how to cast magic. Estefania was in shock. She had not yet been able to do anything, and this boy immediately determined that she did not have magic. The boy began to be indignant that everyone was already tired of these old farts. They were always quarreling over all sorts of trifles. Estefania asked him if he was probably local, and if there was any way to stop them. Otherwise, at this rate, they would destroy the whole city. The boy with a smile on his face began to reassure Milady, and said that this was impossible while there was a master in the city. While Estefania was carefully listening to the boy, those two men took off sharply and flew into the wall, and glass shards began to fall again. She got very scared and looked at the sky. There she saw Overcoat, the same magician for whose sake the guy who was thrown against the wall, began to be indignant that he was in pain, and said, "What kind of bastard dared to get into our place?" and fell silent. In the sky he saw Magai and realized that they were screwed. The magician asked in a very rude tone how they dared to disturb his peace with their stupid squabbles. These two guys quickly fell to their knees and began to beg for forgiveness, saying that they had a little quarrel and did not want to disturb him. But the magician was very angry and once again threw them against the wall. The fragments flew in all directions. The boy asked Milady if everything was all right, but she had no time for him. She looked at the magician with admiration and tears in her eyes and said how incredible he was. She couldn't believe that she saw Mr. Overcoat live. She began to worry whether he would leave now and she would never see him again. With uncertainty, she began to shout to him, "Mr. Overcoat, please forgive me." He turned around and began to listen carefully to Estefania, looking her straight in the eyes. Seeing that he paid attention to her, the girl was confused and could barely make any sounds. Plucking up courage, she finally said that she loved Mr. Overcoat with all her heart. He didn't know what to say. He was seized by a strong stupor. She looked at him with startled eyes and waited for him to say something. While she was waiting for him to say something, she thought that as soon as she saw his beautiful face, these words came out. Without saying anything, the magician turned sharply and began to fly away. Estefania began shouting after him to stop. Seeing that he continued to fly away, she was very upset. The little boy began to worry about Estefania and said to my lady. The girl immediately apologized for the fact that he had to see something so strange, but more importantly, she never thanked the boy for saving him. Then you caught words of gratitude and asked his name. The boy was filled with joy. His big green eyes filled with happiness and shone from what he heard, so he happily said that his name was Yuchi. She watched with emotion how happy he was and heard in response a counter question of what her name was. She kindly replied that her name was Estefania. Estefania, Yuchi said admiringly and asked if she could just be called Fani. Estefania was very surprised but allowed Yuchi to call herself Fani. Yuchi was very happy, began to jump high and shout loudly, "Hooray!" Estefania watched this and thought how much joy there was in his voice. It would seem such nonsense. She even began to envy him. Then the boy asked Fani if she must have arrived in the Central Lands for a magical request. She replied that yes, it was. She wanted to take advantage of this opportunity and meet with Mr. Overcoat. There are two types of people in this world: normies, those who cannot cast magic, and magicians. At one time, the norms were afraid of the greatness of magicians, which is why the latter came up with a special service. Magic requests. Requests for help from any part of the continent flow here, into the lands of the magicians. They, in turn, are obliged to fulfill any need that arises. And the baby said that he was ready to fulfill her request. Although you can't tell from him, he is quite a powerful magician. Estefania suddenly became sad and began to apologize because she wanted to ask Mr. Overcoat for help personally. The boy was very surprised by this desire, but said that Estefania would not succeed. The girl confidently asked why she shouldn't succeed. Yuchi answered her that, to tell the truth, there is no guarantee that the master will personally answer her request. First, the special services will study her request, then they will determine the complexity of the task, and then they will appoint a magician. The master deals only with extremely difficult cases. Estefania drooped, and Yuchi continued to say that he could listen to Estefania, and depending on her request, he would be able to answer exactly whether the master would take her on. And the girl was all in her own thoughts, and thought that nothing would come of it. She didn't even know that such a policy existed in the Middle Lands. Her plan to meet with Mr. Overcoat failed in a matter of seconds. Then Yuchi asked Fani in a wary voice if she wanted to marry the master. She was shocked by such a question and did not expect to hear this. Next, he asked if he understood everything correctly, and explained why he thought so. She confessed her feelings to the master. Fani began to deny and explained that he had misunderstood everything, and she did not want to marry him. She was just a fan and nothing more. This is how Yuchi answered and asked for forgiveness for such a ridiculous assumption. Ladies often come to them with such a request. It was indeed written in the novel that many wanted to marry him, but Estefania, seeing the truth in Fani's words, the boy said that if she wanted to meet him so badly, he could help. Estefania was very happy and asked how he would do it. He can arrange this, although this cannot be done. The boy kindly asked to keep this a secret and happily said that we could hit the road to meet the master. By snapping his finger, the boy made Estefania's things fly. The suitcase flew up and fell into her hands. The hat flew up and ended up on her head. Suddenly, a flying broom appeared in front of her. Her suitcase was hanging on it, and the boy screamed cheerfully for her to sit down. In an instant, they took off, rose high above the ground, and the boy joyfully shouted for her to hold on tight. They arrived quickly, and now she found herself right in front of him. She, of course, dreamed of meeting him, but not in the same environment. Estefania said Yuchi just walked her to the throne room and ran away. The magician had no choice, so he decided to listen to her and told her to say whatever she wanted. She has no choice. She is already here, so she must fulfill her dream. She was grateful to the magician for the fact that, despite his busyness, he devoted time to her, and she would also like to ask him, as the most powerful magician of the Middle Lands. She asked to be allowed to stay in this castle for 2 months. He looked at her with a very menacing look and warned that this joke could cost her her life and asked if she was aware of this. And it's true, if she's not careful with her words, he might actually kill her. This is the man, Overcoat Crowley. Of course, she doesn't mind falling at his hands, considering that in any case she will die, but since she had already come so far, she did not intend to retreat from what she had started, and told him that she was not joking at all, that he should take her request seriously. She introduced herself, and said that her name was Estefania Lana Bilest, and said that she was the crown princess of the Eastern Kingdom. She said that she was not born with blue eyes, which are considered to belong to the royal family. Her family was exiled, but despite this, royal blood still flows in her veins. Here, in their country, she is not afraid of the laws of the East. The Central Lands is a kingdom where the laws of others apply, and everyone has the right to receive protection and support here. Even if the king, her father, knows where she is, he cannot do anything. She realizes that she cannot enjoy his hospitality forever, so she wants to go to another continent. The magician sat and listened carefully to what Estefania was trying to convey to him. She continued to say that, however, now there is neither money nor documents to sail to another continent, so she asks Overcoat to give her a roof over her head for 2 months so that she can earn money and leave this country. Although it didn't sound like a lie, Mr. Overcoat asked what would happen to him from this. Estefania did not expect such an answer and looked at him with surprised eyes. Then he told her, "Let's say she's a princess, but what's the point of keeping her here?" He was right in saying that no magician would fulfill a request without any benefit for himself, and she needed to offer something valuable in return. She thought that then he would not be able to refuse her and said that she would explain everything now. The magician asked Estefania, "Is it really a full moon night?" She asked him with a smile, "Does he hate her or what?" The power of magicians increases depending on the phase of the moon. At the moment of the full moon, they rise to the peak of their strength. And only Mr. Overcoat, the strongest magician, cannot bear this day. The full moon helps bring the magician's power to a whole new level. But for Overcoat, his power gets out of control and brings him incredible pain and suffering. Only Estefania knew about this because she read the novel. The gentleman must already be feeling bad. The full moon would soon come, so the girl took the medicine out of her pocket, showed it to the gentleman, and said that it would help him relieve the pain. He looked at this medicine and smoothly raised his finger up. The blue bottle instantly took off and floated through the air right into the hands of the Overcoat. He began to magically analyze the contents of the bottle, as if he didn't trust the girl. She saw it and said that there was no poison there, and that she could drink it in front of him if he didn't believe her. He looked at the bottle and drank the contents at his own risk. Estefania remembered the recipe for this medicine. It was also described in the novel, as well as the step-by-step method of preparation. She prayed that everything would work, and that this medicine would help him. After he took this medicine, he really felt better. Estefania breathed out a sigh of relief. All her worries disappeared, and she said thank God it worked. Overcoat asked Estefania, how long will the effect of the medicine last? Dejected, she said that the effect would not last long, and advised taking it on the night of the full moon. He became very interested in where she learned the recipe for this drug. Confused, she said that a wizard taught her. He became even more interested in what kind of wizard this was, and he asked her who taught her. But knowing how Estefania made this medicine, she decided not to tell the truth. He said that if he gave out his name, he would no longer have to fulfill her request. But in her thoughts, she knew that this man was Mr. Overcoat. Or rather, he is like a character in a novel. There was a scene in the novel when during the full moon, Overcoat was in pain, and the main character tried in every possible way to ease his suffering. She really regrets having to use knowledge from the original story. She doubted that her actions would affect the plot, because she would inevitably die. And Mr. Overcoat will live a happy life with her younger sister Angelica. The Overcoat lit a blue fire on his hand and said that Estefania was brave for an ordinary woman. The girl did not have time to understand anything, when suddenly Overcoat pounced on her and, pressing his hand to her shoulder, knocked her to the ground. Estefania was very frightened, and the thought flashed through her head that now was the time to confess. The overcoat was holding a sword over her chest, and the girl still did not understand what he meant. He begins to question her and say, "In the city she confessed her love to him, didn't she?" And then she thought about the fact that Mr. Overcoat was not interested in women and relationships, so she thought that she would not attach importance to her words. But all this time he remembered them. He continued and asked if this was all strange. She found a medicine that will cure his illness and asks to live with him under the same roof. Estefania looked at him and couldn't believe her ears, but he continues to say that she wants to seduce him, like all the other girls. He sees through such people, and she is not interested in his personality or any feelings. All she needs is the status of the bride of a great magician, and asked, "Is that right?" Hanging her head in resentment, she quietly said that this was all untrue and he was mistaken. Hearing this, he asked her to explain her words. With confidence in her eyes, she looked up and said that she didn't know about other women, but she really likes him without any benefit. She also began to say that he has the right not to love her, but she will not allow him to say that her feelings are not real. He sat in shock at such revelations on her part, and tears rolled into her eyes from such a sincere confession. She fell in love with him back then. Her life was full of difficulties, failures, and misfortunes, and only the overcoat was an outlet. When it was difficult or sad, she always reread her favorite passages with the overcoat. While he looked at her, she continued to say that she also had no plans to become his wife. Yes, she likes him. She will leave the continent in 2 months and she has countless plans. Realizing his mistake, Overcoat could not say anything to her in response and thought about her words. Suddenly they locked eyes. The overcoat looked at her in fascination, and she looked at him with frightened eyes. And then with a smile he asked if she really loved him. Lights of happiness shone in her eyes, and she said that she really loved him very much. He was pleasantly shocked that he came across such a sincere girl. Smiling, he said that he agreed to fulfill her request. She couldn't believe her ears and asked again if he was telling the truth. With a smile, he said that it was all true. Out of joy, she began to promise him that she would live here lower than the grass and quieter than water, and would not bother him. But one thing confused her, and she asked why he still asked her about her feelings for him. He replied that he was just once again convinced of one thing. Estefania asked interestedly what he was convinced of. He replied that he was convinced that she was ideal for the role of his bride. Estefania froze with a smile on her face and could not believe that she heard such a thing from him. He saw that she was floating in her thoughts and asked if she was listening to him at all. She replied that she was listening but did not understand what he meant. The overcoat repeated to her that she was ideal for the role of his bride. She didn't show that she was happy, but inside she had so much joy. Bride? That means he wants to marry her, right? But why? In the original novel, Overcoat only loved Angelique. She continued to think, what does she have to do with it? He tells her that she should think soberly and asks that she understand him correctly. He was tired of meeting every month with girls who wanted his hands, so he thought it would be nice to marry Estefania. That is, a fake marriage. The overcoat still doesn't need anyone's love. Because of his status as a great magician, he gained control in the Central Lands. Overcoat is considered the most powerful ruler among all the kingdoms. Simply put, once you win the heart of Mr. Overcoat, you become the wife of the most powerful man on the continent. That's why he began to suspect Estefania, because every girl wants to be his bride because of her status. It's not that she's against a fake marriage, but in 3 months she will die, and in 2 months she must get out of the Central Lands. Estefania asked Mr. Overcoat if everything suits him. After all, in 2 months she will leave him. He replied that their union would not last long, and they would not be able to avoid rumors if they ended the marriage so quickly. He doesn't care much about this, and she became his bride. Her interruption here will not seem suspicious. In addition to Mr. Overcoat, many other magicians live in the castle, and if suddenly the Norm begins to live, this will attract a lot of unnecessary attention, but in the role of Mr. Overcoat's bride, she will be able to avoid sidelong glances in her direction. She happily said that since this was the case, she agreed. Smiling, he said that they agreed. Estefania asked what should she do now. She should probably behave somehow appropriately. But Overcoat replied that this is not necessary. First, she needs to assign a bodyguard so that she can turn to him for all questions. She wondered why she needed a bodyguard. Meanwhile, the overcoat turned around and told someone to get out. And then she hears that someone asks if Sumter called him, and a young man appears in front of them. Estefania looks at him and wonders, what kind of character is this? They made eye contact, and this young man was shocked. Then he said that everything was clear. Another fan came to Overcoat again. Just a second, and he would instantly get rid of her and everything would be all right. But Mr. Overcoat said that this was his bride. This young man was even more shocked. The Overcoat said that from this day on, the safety of Estefania is his concern. He was a little shocked and couldn't believe that Overcoat's bride herself was now his concern. He said that he understood everything and was ready to get to work. Estefania said that the Overcoat, as always, did not explain anything and left well in general in his spirit. The young man said that of course he didn't understand anything, but since the master said, then okay. Estefania introduced herself and said that she was very glad to meet you. Then the young man introduced himself and said that his name was Elliot, and that he was the master's right hand. Then Stefania thought about it, and said that she didn't seem to remember that there was a character named Elioth in the novel. While Estefania was thinking, Elioth assumed that Milady was captivated by his beauty. Although he can understand her, this is the reason why the master hired him as an assistant. He continued to say how wonderful he is and how he loves himself. This is his gift and curse. What can you do? He was born so perfect and beautiful. He's a very peculiar person. He grabbed Estefania by the hands and said, just listen, daughter-in-law. And he continued to say how hard it was for him to live with his beautiful face, that he had a bad feeling about something. A couple of hours later, he continued to tell his stories and said, this is what happened to him. Can you imagine he told them, please don't quarrel because of me. Estefania's face showed that she was tired, but what could she do? But they didn't listen to him at all. Oh, how hard it is to live when you attract attention to yourself. Stefania wanted to stop him talking and just said his name. He asked her if she wanted to ask him something. She replied that there was enough talk about his beauty for today. The two of them looked out the window and Estefania said that it was already night outside and said that from today, she would live in this castle and she would like to rest. Elliot apologized and said that they had completely started talking and that he would show her to the room. They walked along a spacious corridor, and Estefania thought that at first it was impossible to shut him up, but now he was so quiet. When suddenly, he again began to say that he considered one of the most beautiful people in the world. Then he calmed down and asked, but do you know who is truly perfect? This is Mr. Overcoat Crowley, and it's not about a perfect face or magic. He is beautiful, like a lonely rose in the garden that no one dares to touch. Then he turned around and said that in his opinion it was so. Why did she turn to Stephanie? She asked what he wanted. He told her that he loved her very much, beautiful things, and she hates it when someone tries to dishonor their beauty. And the bride prophesies a beautiful image of our master. Estefania didn't understand what was happening at all and made a surprised face. Elliot saw her frightened face and began to laugh very loudly and hard. She stood in even greater shock and heard him tell her, what kind of face were they making, my lady? I know very well that your status is fake. Wiping away tears of laughter, he said that he had no idea why the master needed a fake bride. Having calmed down, he asked with a serious face, this is a lie, right? She answered correctly and began to explain that due to circumstances, she needed to live here for some time, but other than our status, nothing. And fell silent, then asked again about the status, right? He replied that this may be true now, but he thinks that they will be connected only by status. The master is a very charming young man. It's not surprising to fall in love with him, but what if she wants to become his lover? She herself does not know what her feelings for him will be. She began to make excuses and said no, it's not for her. She didn't finish and he put his finger in her mouth. And he himself told her that the master would never love her, but he will remember this. While talking about all this, they finally reached the room and Elliot said that this was her room. Elliot said that no one has lived here for a long time, so it might be a little dusty. Estefania was already coughing from the amount of dust and asked, do you think this is a little... He replied that nothing could be done. The master asked to find you a room, but this is the only free bedroom in the castle. She said that no, she understood everything. He also assigned a bodyguard to her, although he was not obliged. She was very grateful to him for this. And she said that it would be nice to clean up here. Eliot added that they did not advise her to leave the room without his accompaniment, otherwise something terrible could happen to her. Not understanding anything, she asked him again what he meant, but without waiting for an answer, she saw him turn around and just wish her sweet dreams. But she did not despair and started cleaning. Lifting the sheet, so much dust began to fly that tears began to flow from her eyes. Having straightened the sheet, she leaned against the sofa and said that compared to life in a mansion with her mother and little sister, It was like heaven. She lay down on the bed, started looking at the ceiling, and thought how long this day had lasted. She remembered how two men were arguing, how a cute little boy came up to her and took her to Mr. Overcoat. She remembered the meeting with Overcoat. Still, she had a lot of fun today. She liked this day. She would never have thought that on the very first day meeting Mr. Overcoat, apparently luck was on her side. Closing her eyes and cupping her face in her hands, she said she saw him smile. Live! Apart from Elioth, the day turned out to be very successful. She would never have thought that she would meet her favorite character while still alive and in her right mind. And positive events have a good effect on her mental and physical state. Her mother must be shocked by her departure. I wonder if she even cares about her. But if she had said goodbye to her in person, her mother would never have let her go. Now she has only begun to live up to her mother's words about selfishness. 3 days earlier, Estefania was sitting and washing something in a basin. Her mother ran up to her and called her. Estefania turned around and asked what happened. Her mother replied that she wanted to discuss something with her. After all, it will be a birthday very soon. She stood with surprised eyes and thought about her birthday, and thought that she had completely forgotten about it. Her 16th birthday would be in 2 months just before she died. Angelica decided that she wanted to take revenge on the royal family for making her sister and mother suffer. She made this decision on the very day that her older sister left the world forever. 16 years old is the age of majority here. What an irony. She won't even live to reach adulthood. Her mother believes that Angelica's birthday this year should be celebrated in a special way, since she will become an adult. So Mom needs Estefania's help. She wants to buy the dress that Angelica wanted so much, so Estefania... Before she could finish speaking, Estefania said she had to give it up. Her mother, as always, thinks only about Angelica, and now about her gift, so she buys it herself. She won't be here on her birthday anyway, and she doesn't see the point in helping. This is such a special day for her younger sister. Doesn't she really want to please Angelica? Estefania began to prove to her mother that it was her birthday, too. They pamper Angelica in every possible way. It's already beyond the bounds of reason. Suddenly, her mother shouted at her, and Estefania froze, and Mom started shouting very loudly that she was the older sister, so she had to go and please her little sister. Doesn't she understand that Angelica was born sick and helpless? And she, unlike Angelica, is not constrained by illness and can do whatever she wants. Is it so difficult to please her on this special day without always thinking only about yourself? Her mother was never on her side, so Estefania decided to silently leave the house. Estefania asked if she were her youngest daughter. Would she work just as hard for her happiness? Mom asked why such questions. The girl said it was just like that. Then her mother said that this was all nonsense and she was tired of arguing with her. Half asleep, Estefania said goodbye to her mother forever. When she came to her senses, she realized that it was just a dream. Getting out of bed, she thought that she was very thirsty. Fleetingly, she looked out the window and saw someone's scary red eyes there. Estefania was seized by a very strong horror, and she climbed out of bed. She ran to the wall and slid down it, then in a trembling voice asked what the hell this was. She remembered Elliot's words that he did not advise leaving the room without his accompaniment. Otherwise, terrible things could happen to her. Curled in fear, Estefania began to speculate that this was what Elliot had warned her about. The next morning, Elliot comes with a tray to Estefania and asks why her eyes are red. With a smile on his face, he says that he has no idea what could have happened. He goes on to say that you can find anything in the castle. Spirits, demons, fairies, although maybe some young sorcerer summoned a familiar and could not cope with him. Well, in general, the full moon is approaching. The magic of all the wizards of the tower is increasing every day. But he said, if she leaves the room without him knowing, she will be in danger. But how does he know that if she stays in this room, she will be safe? He answered her that there was not a single corner in the central lands in which she could consider herself safe. She was very upset and could not say anything in response. Seeing that there were no questions, he handed her her breakfast. Estefania said that she appeared quite unexpectedly in this castle, and they didn't count on food for her. But is that all? On the plate there was only a bun and a glass of water. Elliot replied that that was all and asked if there was something that didn't suit her. Out of politeness, the girl remained silent and did not say that this was not enough for her. Having heard nothing in response, Elliot said with a smile, "That's nice." Turning around, he said that if she wanted to wash her clothes, the bathroom was over there. Estefania also asked if she could meet with Mr. Overcoat. He replied that the master had left the castle because of an urgent assignment. He will arrive only in 6 days. 6 days on the full moon. She thought that he would need a new dose of medicine. She should prepare him for his arrival. Then she thanked him with a smile for warning him and said that she understood everything. He said no problem, but at that time she had no idea what kind of torment Elliot had in store for her. Estefania had a very bad stomachache from hunger. She was spinning and thinking how incredibly she wanted to eat. Over the course of these 5 days, Elliot did everything possible to make her want to escape from the castle on her own. She saw him only once a day when he brought her breakfast, always consisting only of bread. Unfortunately for Elliot and for herself, she has nowhere to return. But being here is truly difficult, even morally. Since she eats once a day, she has almost no strength left. Even moving is difficult for her. She can't sleep well at night because she's afraid of seeing the pair of red eyes outside her door again, and she's shivering incredibly. She stood up and thought that if she continued to live like this, she would die of hunger rather than of illness. She got out of bed and said that she couldn't stand it anymore. If she stayed one more day in this room, she wouldn't be able to open her eyes in the morning. Walking out into the corridor, she walked forward and whispered that she needed to find Yuchi. I passed the window. She looked through it and saw a familiar face. She saw Magdalena Lively there and was surprised at what she saw. The antagonist of the original story, but in love with the overcoat, Madalena irritated many readers with her stubbornness. It was she who prevented Angelica from getting closer to Overcoat in any way. In the original, Overcoat tried in every possible way to avoid Magdalena. Did he really take Estefania as his wife just so that Magdalena would leave him behind? Most likely this is the case, but if Estefania becomes the bride of the Overcoat, she may be in danger in the form of a villain who has gone rogue. If she saw her right now, there would be very bad consequences. Then she began to convince herself that this was not so, but suddenly she felt very bad, and she thought that she needed to return to the room before Magdalena saw her. Suddenly she started coughing very hard and loudly. Looking at her hand, she realized that she had started coughing up blood again. Without having time to do anything, she suddenly fainted. Angrily running down the corridor, Elliot angrily said how Estefania annoys him. He thought that she would run away from here on the first night. As soon as this girl was brought to the castle, he began to follow her. But because of the magic that the master cast on his office, he could not hear what they were talking about. And then, having heard the master's wishes, he realized that he wanted to get rid of her. Once he gets her to leave, the master will immediately notice his potential. In fact, he lied a little to this ugly girl. The master's right hand is a little brat. He found out that Estefania was the crown princess of an eastern country, and that must be why the master did not take her out of the castle using such a rude method, but wanted this girl to leave of her own free will. Elliot walked up to the master's door and began shouting loudly that he had already arrived and wanted to tell him something interesting. The master sat attentively and listened as Elliot with a joyful face talked about how everything was just as the master wanted. This girl was about to leave the castle, because he had done a great job of it. Elliot was more than confident that he understood his desire correctly, thought that he would praise him and promote him. The master suddenly grabbed him by the neck and suspended him in the air. But why? Is the master right now trying to kill him? Elliot didn't understand why this happened to him and asked the master to spare him. The master let him go. He fell to the ground and began coughing loudly, choking. In a very rude tone, the master asked where Estefania was now. Elliot asked why he needed to know this. He ordered this video to get rid of her and promised that he would handle it himself. Before he could finish speaking, the master kicked him very hard in the stomach. Elliot didn't understand why this was happening to him. He didn't understand the master's anger. He didn't understand why he was angry, because Elliot did everything the master wanted. The master replied that he asked to take care of his bride. Elliot jumped up in surprise and said that he understood. She was the princess of the Eastern Kingdom, and the master could not throw her out the door so easily, so he asked him to deal with her. Is he mistaken? The master wanted to get rid of her like all other women, so what did he do to deserve this anger then? When he didn't hear the answer to where Estefania was, the master cut off his hand. In a ruder tone, the master again asked to answer immediately where she was. In a trembling and frightened voice, Elliot replied that she was in the room at the end of the eastern corridor. Was Elliot wrong? And this girl would be truly dear to the master from the very beginning. Without missing a second, Overcoat rushed into Estefani's room and saw that she was lying unconscious. He picked her up and carried her to a more comfortable place for her. Very soon, Estefania woke up in an incredibly beautiful room and a soft bed. She stood up, looked around, and couldn't figure out where she was. There was an incredibly luxurious room around her. Having looked around, she realized that she had never been here before. She would definitely remember that she fell asleep in this room. Looking back, she remembers returning to her room and passing out from hunger, but waking up on the floor a couple of hours later. Then she washed her hands of the blood, and the last thing she remembers was how she fell on the bed out of helplessness and fell asleep. She didn't wake up after that, or at least she doesn't remember it. She continued to rack her brain. How did she end up here? Suddenly the door opened and Yuchi entered. She saw Estefania on the bed. He started running, pounced on her with joy, and shouted "Fanya ya ya." Then his mood changed and he began to ask for forgiveness with a pitiful face. Estefania didn't understand why he was apologizing and asked what happened. He explained that he was sorry for not keeping an eye on her and her running into that damn narcissist. Then, Yuchi assumed that she must be very tired, and he attacked her like this. With piteous eyes, he asked how Estefanic was feeling because she slept a lot. She said with a smile that everything was fine. She was just very tired and nothing more. Yuchi said in surprise that she was forced to live in a dirty closet for a whole week, was hardly fed, and was not allowed out of the room. This is not a joke at all. Estefania asked how he knew all this, or did the master tell him? He said that the master told him this, and he started it all with the fact that now she is his bride, and then she told him about all this. Yuchi told her that it was he who was supposed to look after her, but he was urgently called to the city for a request, and the Overcoat was forced to entrust her protection to Elliot. However, Mr. Overcoat had no idea that Elliot would keep her in such terrible conditions, and according to Yuchi, Mr. Overcoat severely punished him for this. At least she's glad that Yuchi is looking after her now. Why, Estefania asked Yuchi, did he bring her into the room? Before he could answer anything, he heard a rustling sound appear behind him. Seeing the master from behind, Yuchi joyfully shouted to the master that Fanya had woken up. Fanya and the master met their gazes, and for a while they simply looked into each other's eyes. Seeing this picture, Yuchi got out of bed and said that he would bring her breakfast. Walking out the door, he said with a smile that they should keep it confidential while he was gone. Left alone, she began to tell him that Yuchi told her everything, apparently personally gave orders and brought her to this room. But she was happy with the room Elliot put her in, so, "Please don't scold Yuchi," Estefania asked. She apologized for making him worry so much. Suddenly she remembered that she had prepared medicine for him and began to get out of bed. She still got up and said that she would now return to the room and bring him. Without finishing what she wanted to say, she suddenly began to fall for no apparent reason. Mr. Overcoat caught her and carefully caught her so that she would not fall or hit herself. Oh, what a wonderful smell. Is it a perfume or a laundry conditioner? She had never smelled such a smell. It couldn't be compared to anything. Having come to her senses and stopped flying in her wonderful fantasies, she asked herself, what is she doing now? She jumped away from him and asked for forgiveness, said that she didn't mean to touch him on purpose. It won't happen again. Putting his hand on her shoulder, he pushed her onto the bed and she flew onto it. She wanted to bring him medicine and asked the Lord of the Overcoat, what about his Lee? Before he could finish speaking, he covered her mouth with his hand and asked her to be silent for a little while. The Overcoat asked Estefania who she thought she was. Who is she? She didn't understand anything what he was talking about. He answers her. How can she allow some servant to treat herself so rudely? Boorish. But Elliot brought her food straight to her room every day. And water, too. She felt so bad not because of Elliot's actions, just her health. Estefania didn't have time to finish speaking when Overcoat addressed her by name. She sat in shock because Overcoat was the first to address her by name. In the original story, Overcoat never called people by name. He had no need for it. He just didn't remember the names of the people who surrounded him. He only remembered the name once when he first met Angelica and was amazed by her beauty. Then the Overcoat said that this was all disgusting, and Estefania could not understand what he meant. He replied that her politeness and self-destruction were incredibly annoying, and asked what she was trying to achieve with such an attitude towards herself. She was confused and began to stutter, but she could only tell him, "I'm sorry." He loudly began to tell her that he was her fiancé, let her communicate with him as an equal. Then he asked her to raise her head and speak clearly, otherwise he would not be able to understand her feelings. She was used to always putting herself lower than others for her own safety, but with him, she didn't have to behave that way. She fell in love with Mr. Overcoat because he was always a very kind person. He pulled his hand over her face and said that she must always talk to him, no matter what happens, whether you feel bad, sad, happy, whether you like something or not, because Estefania is his fiancée. Then Yuchi bursts into the breakfast room and loudly says that he brought everything. We'll see this picture, he said he'll come by a little later. To avoid an awkward moment, she asked Yuchi to stay and not go anywhere. Yuchi turned on his care, told her to open her mouth and began to feed Estefania with a spoon. Estefania covered her mouth with her hand and said that she wouldn't eat that much. Yuchi looked at her with sad eyes and said that he tried so hard to prepare this breakfast, and asked if she didn't like it. Estefania can't even look at him, his charm blinds her eyes. How can he eat calmly if they are literally devouring her with their eyes? Yuchi noticed this and told the master to leave because he was embarrassing my lady. The master simply left without saying anything. Estefania had already begun to swear, but Yuchi didn't care and continued to feed her. Yuchi then asked her if she knew why he couldn't heal her fatigue with magic. She asked why, but then she asked for time to think. It seems to her that she didn't describe herself about Roma. The reason for this was something she didn't remember at all. Well, since she didn't answer and doesn't know, then Yuchi will explain everything to her now. And they started with the basics. Every person's body contains magical power. In their world, people whose amount of magic exceeds acceptable limits are called wizards. For every person, the amount of magic is an innate trait, like, for example, the eye color of a baby. So from a very early age, you can determine whether a child will become a magician or not. And now it's time for sudden questions. If Skis was born with my chess standard, what is the likelihood that he will become a magician when he grows up? She thought about it and replied that maybe 30%. He replied that it was wrong, no chance. A magical norm is not capable of becoming a wizard, never. Norma will never be able to become a wizard, and even no full moon will help them. And if they try to artificially increase their magical power, then there will be a high risk of death when using healing magic. The wizard directs his magical power into another person. Estefania began to say that if the amount of magical power in a patient is lower than that of a wizard, it will express death, so normally no types of magic can be used. Yuchi replied that everything was correct and said how smart Fanya is. Estefania replied that this is all because Yuchi is an excellent teacher. Even before arriving in the Central Land, she clearly knew that no magic could heal her. She no longer hoped to be cured of her illness. All she wanted was to meet Mr. Overcoat. Estefania then asked why he started this conversation. He replied that when he was in her room, he noticed something. There was a bucket of water in the corner, and all this water was bloody red. She was confused and remembered what was happening at that moment and why the water was red. And with the help of magical analysis, he realized that this was Estefania's blood. Yuchi then asked if it was true that she was trying hard to hide something. She's not injured, so where does the cow come from? She cannot tell the truth about her illness. She would have to lie, and then she started saying that she didn't want to tell anyone. But she became so dizzy from hunger that she fell and injured the back of her head a little. She began to bleed, but she immediately cleaned everything up and washed her hair. Yuchi was shocked by what he heard, and he was very scared when he found out that she fell and injured her head. Then he asked to look at the wound. Estefania began to say that it was too early and there was no need to worry so much. Yuchi began to say worriedly, how can he calm down after learning that she has a wound on her head? And then she realized that she had made it even worse. She began to say that everything was fine, her head didn't hurt, so she shouldn't worry. Yuchi asked if she really shouldn't worry about her. She again repeated that everything was fine with her and there was no need to worry. Yuchi then continued to say that they mages cannot heal the wounds of magical norms. Yuchi began to beg Estefania very strongly. If something hurts, talk about it right away, and he will make sure that she is examined by a doctor. She began to ask him why this was not the very first time they met, and he answered her that this is all because she is a very inspiring girl. She repeated inspirational, but she didn't do anything like that. Yuchi just silently looked at her with the kindest smile she had ever seen. She never knew what he meant, but for some reason this smile suddenly made my soul feel so warm and calm. Snapping his fingers, a beautiful pale pink dress appeared in his hands, and he said that she needed clean clothes. This dress is enchanted, so it can adjust its size to the person who wears it, and asks if she would like to try it on. When Estefania saw this dress, she said that it was a very beautiful shirt. She asked if she could really take it. Yuchi replied, of course you can, because it was made especially for her. Then she asked if he made this dress for her. Yuchi answered no and said that there was a sorceress in their castle who sewed outfits for all of them. And she thought, the sorceress, does she really sew outfits for all the inhabitants of the castle? Estefania didn't even know that such magic existed, and asked me to convey my gratitude. Then Yuchi said that it was the master who instructed the sorceress to sew this shirt, and it was also he who brought it here. Estefania asked again in surprise. That is, it was not Yuchi who found her in the room, Mr. Overcoat? Yuchi said that the master personally interrogated Elliot and forced him to reveal where she was, and then immediately went to her room. He could not let his beloved bride get hurt. Well, beloved is a strong word. She and Mr. Overcoat have a completely different relationship. With a surprised face, he asked, don't they love each other? Estefania replied that before drawing any conclusions, Hai would tell her how Mr. Overcoat provided her. Yuchi replied that the master didn't really say anything. He simply said that from that day on she became his bride, and that now Yuchi was obliged to take care of her. Estefania again became convinced that the gentleman did not explain anything to his charges, but this is very important. They misunderstand their relationship. How will she leave Mr. Overcoat after 2 months if he doesn't give them the details? She decided that she should talk to Yuchi about it. As soon as she tried to say a word, with a snap of her finger, she instantly found herself in this new dress. Yuchi said that this was all very interesting, of course, but they had not yet discussed when she would finally recover and began to leave. Estefania grabbed him by the cloak and did not let go, asking him to stay. She apologized and said even if they put her in a better room, but she's still afraid to be alone in the room to tell the truth. He asked her if she was afraid because those red eyes still bothered her. She replied that yes. Although she had only seen them one night, she still couldn't get the image out of her head. That's why she can't sleep peacefully. Estefania asked Yuchi if he knew who it could be. He thought and said that he might know who it was, however. To meet him, you have to wait until night falls. Then he touched his magic finger to her forehead and said that it was time for her to sleep. Estefania immediately fell asleep and he covered her with a blanket. In a gentle and calm voice, he told her to sleep peacefully and let her have the warmest dreams. Night had already fallen and some rustling was heard in the window. Someone climbed into her window and asked if she was awake. She opened her eyes and didn't understand what was happening. Then she saw Mr. Overcoat on his bed. She told her to get up. Then, without explaining anything to her, he picked her up and carried her somewhere. She didn't understand at all what they wanted from her so late at night. In a second they were in the air and she asked, "Are they flying?" Then the gentleman asked her to look down. She lowered her head and saw a whole group of magicians. The gentleman said that Yuchi told him about her fears of being alone in the room, said that she met this creature in the castle. It turns out it was a familiar. Some wizards call upon themselves a familiar servant who helps them in battle and everyday life. That's who she saw in the window that night, and he's not so scary once she faces her fear. He immediately walked away. Yuchi must have asked the gentleman to help her overcome her fear. Joyful Estefania thanked the gentleman for showing her, and they unexpectedly touched their lips to each other. They both realized what had happened, and she could not even think that she would just touch his lips. She was shocked and began to ask for forgiveness, saying that she didn't mean to and that she was very, very sorry. She couldn't even imagine how close they would be to each other. Then Estefania needs to go down otherwise. Then she saw that his face changed sharply. He felt pain, but it wasn't because of her, right? And then she remembered that today is the very day that Mr. Overcoat hates so much. They began to fall sharply. She asked if everything was okay with him, but he did not answer anything. He was only tormented by pain. By some miracle, as they fell, they landed in the room. The overcoat fell to the floor and began to suffer from wild pain. Estefania looked at the overcoat and realized that the magic was bursting out due to the fact that the moonlight fell on him. The mana in the master's body began to get out of control. She began to blame herself and say that it was all because of her. She was so scared. In order to dispel her fear, Yuchi asked the master to show her that familiar. And then she remembered about the medicine and ran after it to immediately bring it to the master.